This is, again, me missing the big picture until somebody showed it to me. And it's this place in New York that I'd heard about where there's this church. And when I first heard about this, I said, I don't want to hear about churches, Michael. You know, to the person, actually it was Keith. I said, I don't want to hear about your churches, Keith, you and your Methodist churches. He said, no, this is a special place. It's called St. Paul's Chapel in New York. It's across the street from where the Twin Towers once stood. And on 9/11, not a single window was broken in that church. It was built in 1766, and when the buildings collapsed, people literally ran into this church and their lives were saved. And to me, this was an architectural fulfillment of two verses in the Bible, and I'll show you why in a minute. But the first verse is Proverbs chapter 18, verse 10. It says, the name of Jehovah is a strong tower. The righteous runs into it and is safe. And the other verse is Exodus 20:24. In every place that I cause my name to be mentioned, I will come to you and bless you. And look, Michael, this is what I saw at the front of that church. And when I was told about this, I didn't believe it. I had to see it with my own two eyes. But what we have here at the front of the church is the name Yehovah in Hebrew. And it appears inside of a triangle. And let's remember that triangle. We'll get back to it. And there's light coming from the name inside of clouds. It appears a second time in the front of the church, and there it's again the name Yehovah inside of these clouds with light coming from the clouds, and that actually appears in the front cover of my book. I actually took this photo, Michael. I went to this St. Paul's Chapel specifically so I could take a photo and show this to people. I couldn't find good photos online, and I bought a camera specifically for that purpose, and I was lying on the ground on my back in New York at St. Paul's Chapel taking these photos, and it was hilarious because this security card came over to me, and I didn't have the best camera, so I thought I better take lots of photos. I specifically made a trip to New York for this, cost me a lot of money, and I want to take a lot of photos because you never know till you get on the computer which one came out. The security guard says, you can't lie on the floor there, it's against the law. I said, okay, I'm almost done, I'll be done in a minute. He said, if you don't get up, I'm going to bring a cop, and I said, okay, you go get the cop, and I took my photos. And by the time he came back, I was gone with my photos. I got this photo, it's beautiful, you can see the name Yehovah at the front of the church, and literally people ran into that church on that day and their lives were saved. I have an example, a testimony of a police officer who shares his testimony of running into that church and his life being saved. It's in my book, Shattering the Conspiracy of Silence. And to me, again, this is an architectural fulfillment. Every place I cause my name to be mentioned, I will come to you and bless you. And the name of Yehovah is a strong tower. The righteous runs into it and is safe. Now, Michael, I've shared this with a lot of people, this whole thing about the name. And I get a lot of people who say to me, and I even have an email here from somebody. Let's see if I can find it. And the email, they say to me, they say, here it is. They say, can you tell me how and where you come up with the spelling Yehovah for Yahweh? Do you mean until you, quote, discovered it? People have been spelling it right and writing it wrong for the last 2,000 years. And it's kind of an obnoxiously worded question, but it's a valid point. It's not a bad point. What, you're the first person to discover this? No one's ever known about this before? And it's an ironic question. It's ironic, Michael, because before the 1800s, when they came up with the pronunciation Yahweh, which the scholars in the 1800s who came up with Yahweh, these German scholars, and it was based on a Samaritan pronunciation of the name, supposedly. That's a whole separate discussion. I don't know that we'll get into that, but I have a great teaching on that called Have You Been Praying to Jupiter? It's a great study. But before that, everybody knew the name was Yehovah. Everybody knew that before the 1800s. And it was a secret. I call my book Shattering the Conspiracy of Silence. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, Michael, but there's a clear conspiracy where the rabbis say that the name is taught by the sages to their disciples once every 7 years, which means it's kept out of the hands of the multitude. That's a conspiracy of silence. Clear as day. And they let it slip. And the point is, Jews are pretty bad at keeping secrets. They tried to keep the secret, but it slipped out in the Hebrew manuscripts. And we saw 5 examples of that, 5 Hebrew manuscripts. Right. But I found this name in other places. We have a mutual friend in Iceland, Sigrun Einar's daughter. I believe she's translated your material into Icelandic.
That's her job. She works for the network, the broadcast our programs, and she translates everything into Icelandic.
Yeah, and she actually translated my book, The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus, into Icelandic as well. And anybody in Iceland can go and read it for free online in her translation. And so one day she sends me this email and she tells me this great story, which I absolutely love. She's sitting at home in Reykjavik or wherever she lives, I don't know. And there's a knock on the door, and it's 2 Jehovah's Witnesses. And so she lets them in. And they start to share their testimony. They've got a certain text they go through. And she stops them and she says, I know the name of the Father. It's Yehovah. And the two Jehovah's Witnesses say, no, it's not. She said, what do you mean? They say, the name of the Father is either Yahweh or it's unknowable. And then she said, then why aren't you called the unknowable witnesses? Or the Yahweh's witnesses? And I think at that point they ran out. But so she sends me this, and she tells me how they also told her about how there are these churches in Iceland that have the name, just like St. Paul's Chapel in New York, the 9/11 Chapel. And I said, we need to get a photo of these things, of these churches, from the National Museum of Iceland. So she sends me this photo here. You can see it. And it's beautiful. It's the name Yehovah with the vowels.
With the vowels
in Iceland. All three vowels, the full set of vowels. So as I said, this was kept as a secret by the Jews, but they were very bad at keeping the secret. I'm not the first one to discover the secret. So the point is, I found it in Hebrew manuscripts. And here's what they did. They did something really clever in the 1800s. They did this bait and switch, these German scholars. They came along and they said, yeah, the whole world thinks the name is Yehovah, or Jehovah in English, but that is a mistake from Christians who didn't know Hebrew. They mistook something, they got confused, and they invented this impossible form, but in fact, that's what appears in the Hebrew manuscripts. So it's not a Christian mistake. But here you have it in this church. And to me, what's so amazing about this thing that Sigrun shared with us is this verse in Malachi. Malachi spoke this prophecy 2,400 years ago. He said, for from the rising of the sun to the place of its setting, my name is great among the nations. Imagine Malachi saying that 2,400 years ago, and then, 1,000 years after him, there's a church in Iceland where the verse is being fulfilled. We're at some edge of the earth, at the ends of the earth, Iceland. No offense to the Icelandic.
The sun never sets and it never rises in the winter.
I mean, you can't get more remote in the world than Iceland. And there they're inscribing his name at the front of their church. Now, look, it's interesting. It's inside the triangle. With light coming from the name inside of clouds. And I've had people say, Nehemia, that's a pagan sunburst. No, it's not. They think that because they don't understand what we're looking at, and I'll explain. Mm-hmm. So I was recently in Sweden, and I went to Sweden. I did a speaking tour in Holland, Sweden, and Norway. And in Sweden, I had an extra day, and they said, you have this day after you speak. Would you like to, we want to take you somewhere to thank you for coming and speaking. Would you like to go and see the ABBA Museum? And, from the rock and roll band.
Dancing Queen?
Yeah, no, I'm like, no, I don't need to go to the ABBA Museum, but I want to know about the name Abba. Do you have anything of the name of our Heavenly Father, Abba, who in Iceland? And we found out that the name wasn't only in Iceland, it was also all over the place in Sweden. And we end up going to 3 churches. And in addition to the 3 churches, we also went, and these are Christian churches, and they have the name Yehovah in them. And we also went to the National Coin Museum, and we saw it all over coins. I want to share some of that with the audience. Can we do that?
Yes.
All right. So this was it in, before I get to that, Michael, I got to share this. So I got the photo from Sigrun, and I said, look, I got to post this on my website, but I need permission from the National Museum of Iceland. Mm-hmm. It's not my photo. I don't want to get sued. So she writes to the museum, and they said, you can use the photo, but only if you tell us what it says. I'm like, yes. So I write back to them, and I give them a full explanation. I say, this is Yehovah with the full vowels. And here's what the artistic message is as well. This image of the triangle in the Jewish art. Now, in Christian art, many Christians will say, well, we know the triangle is the Trinity. I'm not arguing with that. But in Jewish art, you'll find the triangle with the name inside it, and it represents something very different. Actually, not that different in some ways. The name Yehovah inside of the triangle, that triangle represents the meaning of the name Yehovah. And it's interesting, there's no dispute in Jewish sources about what this name is, about what the meaning of the name is. Now it's an interesting thing. I've shared with a lot of rabbis about this discovery of mine, about the meaning, about the pronunciation of the name Yehovah, and the most common answer I get is pshita, which means like no duh. Of course that's of course that's what the pronunciation is. But what does the name mean? And this is something no one has any dispute whatsoever about. It's sung in the synagogue every week. And the name is a combination of the 3 forms of the Hebrew verb to be. The three forms of the Hebrew verb to be are haya, he was, hoveh, he is, and yehyeh, he will be. When you take haya, hoveh, yehyeh, he was, he is, he will be, or he is to come, you get Yehovah. And this isn't even a matter of dispute. We have this song in the synagogue every week. Vehu haya, vehu hoveh, vehu yeh betifara. I won't give up my day job, Michael. I know I admit I'm not a good singer. Okay, guys. Anyway, so haya, hoveh, yeah, there's no dispute that's the meaning of the name. And the really cool thing is recently I was interviewing for my Hebrew Voices podcast this Samaritan scholar. It's a guy who wrote 107 books, really smart guy. And he says to me, we the Samaritans don't pronounce the name of the Father. We know it's written Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, but instead of it, we say Hashem, which in our pronunciation of Hebrew is Hashem. They say in Aramaic, Shema, which is the name, and in their Hebrew, their Samaritan Hebrew, they say Hashem, which is very interesting if you read 2 Kings 17, because according to 2 Kings 17, the Samaritans were foreigners planted in Israel, and some of those foreigners worshipped a god named Ashima. Very interesting. But anyway, I said to him, so what about in the time of Moses? Did the ancient Israelites pronounce the name? He said, no, back then they called God Hashem. He said, but I can tell you what the name means. He said, the name clearly means Haya Hoveh Yehyeh. And how does he know it means Haya Hoveh Yehyeh? The same way the Jews know it means Haya Hoveh Yehyeh. Exodus 3:14, God reveals himself to Moses, and he says, Eheyeh asher eheyeh, which literally means I will be that which I will be. And then we call him Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, which is a combination of Haya Hoveh Yehyeh. Remember we had a previous time we talked about Yeshua came from Yoshia, and I said Yoshia is he will save, Oshia is I will save. So Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, that Yud represents he will. And the Eheyeh is I will be. Yehovah is a combination of Haya Hoveh Yehyeh. He was, he is, he will be. That's the meaning of the name and what the triangle represents in the Jewish art and possibly in the 9/11 church and in Iceland. Now, what I see in Iceland, and I'll show this to the audience here, we have, for example, here is the Finnish church in Stockholm. This is a church where they speak Finnish, but they're in Stockholm, the capital of Sweden. And you have Yehovah. It's inside the clouds with light coming from the clouds with the full vowels at the front of the church. So what is this? Is this a pagan sunburst? And if you didn't know better, you might think that. But actually, I researched this, and it turns out that in European art, you have a theme called the glory. It's actually called that in English, the glory. And the glory comes from Exodus 24:16-17, where it says, and the glory of Yehovah dwelt on Mount Sinai. So there's this thing dwelling on Mount Sinai called the glory. And the cloud covered it. So whatever this glory is, it's covered in a cloud. And the appearance of the glory of Yehovah was like a consuming fire. So it's light inside of a cloud. That's where they got the glory in European art. Now, were they right about it being the name? I don't know. It's art. Who's to say? But the point is they weren't thinking of the pagan sunburst. What they were thinking of is Exodus 24, and there's another verse. There's a bunch of verses. Ezekiel 1:28, like the appearance of the rainbow in the cloud on a rainy day, thus was the appearance of the glow all around. This is the appearance of the likeness of the glory of Yehovah. So when they were portraying this in the 9/11 church and in Reykjavik, Iceland, and in Sweden and Stockholm and in other places, as the name with light coming from the name inside of clouds, they were thinking of this glory. Now, what is the glory? I'll be honest with you, Michael, I don't know. In Jewish literature, the rabbis debated, is the glory Yehovah himself? Or is it an angel of Yehovah? Is it, and are those different things? And Jews have argued about this for over 2,000 years, and what we all agree on is that the glory is the same thing as the Shekhinah, the Shekinah glory. It's the presence of Yehovah. But is that Yehovah himself that dwelt on Mount Sinai, or his angel? There's different views in Judaism. I'm not going to solve that problem. But it was portrayed in European art as the name, sometimes with the vowels. Let me show you a few more places. I know we're running out of time. Here's another place with Yehovah with the full vowels. Again, here it's inside of a triangle with light coming from the clouds. The German church in Stockholm has the name Yehovah with light coming from it, again with the full vowels. Another place, this is called the Scandinavian church in Sollentuna, Sweden. And here is another place with the name coming from the clouds inside of a triangle with light in there, light coming from the name in the clouds. It appears in a bunch of different places. It appears on Swedish and Danish coins.
With the vowels.
Here's the name in a coin from 1644 from King. I love the guy's name of this king. He's Christian IV of Denmark, and he had the name with the full vowels. Here's another coin from Karl IX of Sweden, and I love this coin. This is actually my coin, Michael. This was given to me by the people who hosted me in Sweden. They went on and they bought this from a Swedish auction just for me, and the reason they bought this coin, they spent a lot of money, is that it says in it Yehovah in Latin. It says in Hebrew Yehovah. This one doesn't have the vowels, but again, it's light with light coming from inside the clouds of the name. And it says, Yehovah solatium meum, Yehovah is my comfort. And my name, Nehemia, means Yah comforts. So they bought me this coin. It's a very precious possession of mine. I love it.
And so you have the V pronunciation in Latin on this.
That has to do with how do you pronounce Latin. That's a separate topic. I've spoken to Latin scholars, and they've told me that in ancient Latin, it was actually pronounced W. In modern Latin, they say V, but in ancient Latin, it was Y, and that's a whole separate topic maybe we'll get to. But I want to show you a few more coins. Here's Karl IX of Sweden with the full vowels, Christina of Sweden with the full vowels, and again, it's this theme of the glory, the light, and there's just a bunch of these. It's beautiful stuff. I have to say, though, I am not basing my pronunciation of the name on Swedish coins in Icelandic churches. I want to make that really clear, because I found the name misspelled in Sweden and Iceland, or in Sweden specifically. Here, for example, is a church in Sweden where they wrote the name Yehovah, and that's because they had no idea what these little symbols they were transcribing meant. They wrote Yehovah. My point is that the name appears in the Hebrew manuscript preserved by the Jewish scribes who gave us the oracles of God, preserved for us the oracles of God as Yehovah. What these churches show us is that this isn't something I discovered. It was a secret kept by these scribes, but it was the worst kept secret of all time. And until these people cooked up the name Yahweh, this was the common understanding of how the name was pronounced.